Welcome to the podcast, Carrie.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad. Well, I mean, I knew that you would, but I'm just so glad that you said yes. Thank you very much.
Oh, of course. I'm not going to miss a chance to chit chat with you about writing stuff.
Same here. So, um, in my introduction, I said that you are indie published, which we know that you have the two titles, The Things That We Carry and My Boring Life. So, if we can talk a little bit about because you're also traditionally published through Black Rose Publishing, you have your award-winning Daughter of the King, and you have the second in the Defying the Crown series coming out next year, as well as another title coming out. And I'm
Yeah.
not sure if you've actually announced that yet. So, like the title of the actual book. So,
Oh, I have. Yes. Chasing Eleanor is a YA historical coming out later in 2023.
yes. And I know when it's coming out, and you know when it's coming out, but
Yeah. Yes, I did. I already put it out on in my newsletter and stuff, so we're good.
okay, cool. All right. So, the second in the Defying the Crown series will be out in March of
Yeah,
next year, 2023, and then Chasing Eleanor will be out in June. And
correct.
anyone who wants to subscribe to your newsletter, I'll put it in the description box for the podcast and on the YouTube channel. Do you want to go ahead and tell them your website address?
Yeah. I'm at kerrywrites.com. And yeah, I love connecting with readers or anyone who just loves, writing and history and all that fun stuff.
Absolutely. Now, you love historical fiction as much as I love historical fiction,
Yeah.
but you write primarily historical fiction. I mean, that is your kind of bag. So, do you want to talk a little bit about what drew you to the genre and why you chose to kind of write there specifically?
Yeah, I think it's probably the same with everyone. You don't really choose a genre, it just sort of chooses you. And I think when I started really becoming a reader in my early 20s, I was trying to read all these contemporary books and they were like, okay, they're fine. But the ones that I was hooked on and I couldn't put down were all historical. So I've been an avid historical fiction reader for 20 years. And it just seemed kind of natural that I'd be telling some kind of historical story. And, some people know this about me, but I was raised by a US history teacher and it just played a huge part in my life. This was back in the 80s before they had like AP classes and stuff. So my dad used to host his honors history class in my living room every Thursday night from the time I was a little kid. So I would hide behind the couch or hide behind this like pony wall and I would listen to these high schoolers every Thursday. They'd come over and they'd have these huge, like lively, crazy debates where they'd all be debating these different topics from history. And so I think I just grew up with history being very much alive around me. And I was really fascinated by these stories. But as you and I have talked about, I was like, where are the women? Like, why are we not talking about women in history? And from a very young age, I recognize that. And so I think when you start writing all of these things that you subconsciously have been carrying around your whole life, they find their way out into stories. And so I didn't realize when I started writing that I cared so much about bringing out stories of women from history, but that's exactly where it takes me.
I did the same thing when I was studying history. I was a graduate student in history, and every paper that I did always gravitated toward women's place in history, and because
Yeah.
we learn all about the men who won history, and I always tried to talk about the people who weren't talked about as much, because in history, what do we learn about in school? We learn about military history. We don't learn about the social history. And that's really where to me, that's where the important thing is. And that's right
100%.
where women are, and that's right where minorities are. And so I think it's really important that we have authors who are embracing the historical genre and telling those stories. So
Yeah,
you know how
absolutely.
you know how I feel about it.
I do. And I feel the same way.
So I love Daughter of the King, and
Thank
I
you.
think that everyone should read it. Tell me a little bit, because it's set in 17th century France
Yeah.
and Canada.
Mhm.
So around it's not quite, it's a little bit later than 1619, which is where all the Jamestown stuff
Mhm.
started. But in your in the first novel, this is about Isabel, and she is from La Rochelle in France, where the Protestants are currently 17th
Yeah.
century currently being massacred by the Catholics, and she gets away. And do you want to talk a little bit about just the process of researching that time period, especially with, if you don't speak or read French fluently, how was that
Yes.
process when you were researching that era?
You know, it was tough. I'll be honest. I mean, and I am not a historian like you. I didn't, get a degree in this by any means. So I just kept reading. A lot of textbooks were really helpful. They're so dry, and so it was so boring sometimes to get through just pages and pages and pages to find one little tiny detail, and you're like, okay, great, I can use that. The good thing is, I don't know if it's good or not, it was not ideal at the time, but I had started writing this book just purely from the emotional part of it, of what Isabel might have felt like to be a Protestant almost in hiding in a Catholic country. So I just sort of started writing that, like almost free writing. So it was connected to a little bit more of the emotion of it. And then as I started sort of structuring the story, which of course got rewritten, I don't know how many times, I started researching at that point to find kind of the bigger issues and the details. So it was kind of nice because I already had my character in my mind on a personal level. And I kind of had to break it apart into two pieces. I had to really understand the Protestant struggle, which was kind of, it was hard to understand. You're like, these people were literally not even doing anything, and they just had a different belief system. Like, why were they so heavily persecuted? But that was part of the process of trying to understand the motivations behind people's actions. And yeah, it was a challenge. It was a lot of research, a lot of reading, and I still don't quite understand a lot of it. A lot of it is still kind of beyond my understanding, but yeah, it was great to spend the time doing that, especially as I was rewriting, and then I kept getting to add in a little bit more historical detail, so that when I sat down to write the sequel, I already had so much of that in my mind. Like the big picture stuff was already there, so that was nice. So I just had to more research, specific details in regards to, like what the houses would have looked like in Quebec in 1667. So things like that. And it was really, it's like the big picture stuff and understanding the world at the time. That is what I found just time consuming.
Oh, yes. And like whenever I'm researching, I have a really difficult time when I'm researching for my historical fiction because I really want to focus on the primary sources, the sources that were written during the time from the people who were experiencing them. So I don't always like to focus on the secondary sources, which are kind of the interpretation of what happened. So I like to kind of hear it from the horse's mouth, I guess,
Yeah.
is what I'm
And
saying.
the one that is set in the Great Depression was so much easier to do that with, because there's memoirs, there's tons of firsthand accounts. 1665 or 1661, not so much. So one thing I really found helpful was Google Translate. So I could pull up documents from French Canada at the time, and like actual marriage contracts for these women, and I was able to put on Google Translate. It's not perfect, obviously, but you actually get the gist of how many ox they got, and how much land they got and everything. So that was really helpful.
Now, you talked about this Chasing Eleanor is set during the Depression, and since it's coming out next year, um, so it does make sense that it would be easier to locate those primary sources because more people could read and more people
Yeah.
could write at the time. So, do you want to talk a little bit about did your process for researching Chasing Eleanor, did it differ vastly from your process for researching Daughter of the King and Daughter of Shadows?
I think so, because I couldn't find memoirs from the 17th century. I really couldn't. I found one account of a kid who lived in Quebec at the time. And again, though, like I'm guessing the 15-year-old was probably not writing this account. Maybe someone else was. So yeah, it was really hard. Whereas the Great Depression has been pretty heavily examined, and so there's just massive amounts of memoirs of specifically older individuals looking back on their life, like years after, what it was like to grow up in the Depression. So I loved that because we're talking about people that had survived this really hard but fascinating time of history. And then, 50 years later, they're able to kind of go back there with some perspective. And that was a dream, as far as a historical fiction writer goes. And so I didn't get that in the 17th century. I kind of had to fill in a lot of the blanks just with my imagination.
One thing I noticed, there were some parallels between Daughter of Shadows, which hasn't come out yet, between Daughter of Shadows and Chasing Eleanor. And that is when you were talking about whenever, I can't remember which character it was, but it may have been Isabel recounting how hungry they were
Yeah.
and just the things that they had to resort to eating. And it's the same thing with Magnolia and Chasing Eleanor. You see this struggle for just this struggle for survival. So that's the parallels that I see with all of your writing, is this struggle to survive and ultimately overcoming and being the stronger person because of what you've gone through. And I think that that really points to life experience also, because we're all just trying to survive. And that's one of the things that I find really relatable about your stories is these main characters. Even though Isabel is 17th century French, she feels as current as Magnolia and as current as a character from 2022. Even though there are those differences of character, it's still the base instinct is to survive and to do something good in the world. So
I love that you say that, because I've known that subconsciously, but I don't know that I've ever kind of put that forward in my mind as like, these are the kind of stories you like. But I have to say, it's similar to your writing as well, in the sense that the question that fascinates me is, how do we overcome childhood trauma? Like, how do we take this lot in life that you've been given, that might have not been very fair or not been, what you wanted it to be, and how do you make that into something positive? How, like you said, how do you survive, not just physically but emotionally? And it's definitely a question I probably will continue to evaluate.
Me too. Now, you talked about the many revisions of Daughter of the King, and I also know that you had many revisions of Chasing Eleanor. Now, I am a revision writer, but you are a writer who might have 80,000 words. You realize the story is not working. You toss out 80,000 words and you start over from zero. I can't imagine doing that, but I know
it's not fun. It's not fun.
I know that there are many authors who do this, who say, okay, this isn't working. Let me toss it out and let me start over again. For those of us who can't imagine doing that, can you explain or just kind of, I know you can't really explain it, but can you just kind of give me a little insight as to what exactly goes through your mind when you toss out 80,000 words?
Okay, so I've done it twice, like full, taken the whole thing and put it in a file and never looked at it again. As hard as it was, the first story I did that with was Chasing Eleanor, because I was still learning to be a writer, right? It was only my third book, and it was an emotional story for me. And so I think it was just that constant need to get to the next level. And so when I finished the first draft of Chasing Eleanor, I knew it had problems, but I thought, okay, my critique partners will be able to tell me how I can fix it. And we're all friends, and so we can be lovingly honest with each other. And they kind of said, this is not the story you set out to write. And the moment they said that, I was like, you're right. And so I think it's just being really, really honest with where you're at. And I could have pieced it together to make it better, but in my head, I was like, I feel more secure at this point, being able to just take what worked out of that first story and start fresh. And it gave me, for a pantser, like for you and I are both pantsers, in a way, it was like writing with a plot for the first time. It was like, oh, I have direction now. I'm not just going to fly off and, to all these different directions. And it's interesting because both of the stories that I have rewritten from word one have been just, I've loved the end product. It's actually a really great process because it's almost like free writing your first draft, and then you go, well, I like about 10% of this. So I'm going to take that 10% that resonates with me, and I'm going to really sit down to write the correct draft. So yeah, I kind of almost consider it free writing, and I write so fast that I'm not ever, this is why I always say I always let myself write the wrong thing. And it's okay to do that. And you know, you're not gonna come out with something perfect ever, but I feel like every story can be fixed with time and edits and a little bit of talking it out. And so for me, sometimes it's easier just to go back to drawing board and start with a clean slate and take what I've learned from the first one and be like, okay, well, let's go do the next one. I'm hoping that doesn't happen anymore. Being honest, I don't want to do that. But if it happens, it happens.
But you know, when you said that it's like writing with a plot, with an outline, I feel the same way when I go back and I'm revising and I'm adding those things and fleshing out and taking out and putting in. I feel that way. I'm like, okay, I have a roadmap now because I've written the whole story.
Yeah.
I know everything that happens. So now I can think about the story and I can go back and I can say, okay, these are the things that I need to do. I need to make my characters a little deeper. I need to build the conflict. I need to do this.
Yeah.
So we do the same thing. You're just a little braver than I am, and you just throw the whole thing out. And I'm like, no, I cannot. I can't.
Well, you're a more experienced writer than me, so I don't think your drafts are quite as messy as mine. But what's interesting that you said it is character development for me. That's always where I go wrong, and I realize that part of the reason I kind of go in the wrong direction is I let myself get distracted when I'm writing with new characters, new sidelines, new plots, and it just keeps spinning and spinning. And I roll with it because that's what pantsers do. Because you're like, oh, that's a great idea. And then I realize, like, no, I need to double down on the relationships I've already established. That's where I go wrong.
I get that. I totally get that, especially since I know a little bit about your process and how you work, and I have seen it firsthand by reading your draft. So I get exactly what you're saying. And for me, my characters need to be developed more because they're so shallow. When I write my first draft, there's like, it feels like there's nothing there to that character. So I have to go back and I have to say, okay, really think about this thing that they've been through, or this thing that they're going through. And I really have to put myself inside of them during that revision draft so that I can get the emotions and the conflict and everything else that I need to make it a really powerful story. So,
right. And because you write more leaning up market and literary, it's even more important for your stories. That's why, you know, you have to keep deepening and deepening because the whole story is sort of hinging on that character development.
Yeah. But I think that the same thing can be said overall, because we do want to make sure that all of our characters are well developed, unless of course they're the static characters that we don't really care about anyway, and they are only there for a brief fleeting moment.
Right. But I think that you write that particular style because you're so good at character development, because you can keep going deeper and deeper and deeper. And I write a little more commercial, and I don't like to go that deep. I like my emotions right there on the surface in your face.
And you like very action packed.
Yes.
Most historicals that we read are pretty passive, and we've talked about this a lot, that they might be great stories, but they are very passive. The characters are very passive, and it becomes really frustrating when the characters and the story are so passive, even though the story is good. But with your writing, you just keep the hits coming over and over and over and over. So the reader doesn't really have time to catch their breath to say, "Oh wow, this is a really slow part."
Well, you know, and it's been hard for me to like a mentor that I've been working with for the past year or so. She keeps trying to teach me restraint, and she's right. Because do you know how much bigger and crazier I want to get with plots? But it gets too much at some point, and so I have to learn to like hold that back and only release it. So this is why my critique partner has mentioned that she thinks this is why I'm stepping into historical fantasy, so that I can I can let that need go wild in the fantasy part, and then show restraint in more of the like historical fiction based stuff. And I think she's right, because that's what sort of drew me to light fantasy. You know, I don't write any high fantasy stuff, but because I do want to just go crazy big and wild with these plot ideas, and you know, it has to make sense.
Mm-hmm.
That whole
I
minor
totally
detail.
see that, and I can't wait to read that fantasy.
Yeah.
That, I mean, we can't really talk about it now, but I can't wait. Now, you have been in the query trenches for about a year now, right?
Well, I mean, yeah, not nonstop, but gosh, when did I start with Chasing Eleanor? I don't even remember. Has it? Oh gosh, it might have been a year. I think you're
I think
right.
it's close to a year. Will you, for those listening who might be embarking on the process or who have been in the trenches for a while, can you just talk a little bit about how you handled the ups and downs? I already know the answer to this question, but
I was like, with your help.
But I feel like it would be helpful for other people to hear it.
Yeah. Okay. So here's one thing that I learned. It's a way longer process than you can possibly imagine. And even though I prepared myself for the long process, it wasn't enough. Like I should have just sat back and been like, I'm going to exhaust every single resource on this before I, you know, move on to something else. But you do what you can at the time, because there comes a point where emotionally you're like, I can't do this anymore. Like your mental health straight up is like, I can't obsess over my email anymore. And I can't, you know, be this roller coaster of someone so excited about it and they're like, yeah, not for me, you know. So it's just, you gotta at some point take your own mind and put that where it needs to be. So one thing I did learn is I had a lot of requests. I had something like, I don't know, 9 or 10 requests. So the idea was interesting to people. So that was a learning lesson to me, that when I write my next book, which I, you know, when I was writing Primrose, the next one, I knew I had to get a hook before I started, because I learned that in the querying process, that that's the first thing they're going to look at is the hook. And even if your writing is amazing, they still have to be able to sell it. So that's a moment where I went, okay, I gotta spend some more time on that. So that's the first thing. And then the next thing is that you're going to get a lot of no's, but it doesn't mean that your story isn't worth telling or your story is not good enough. And you hear people say this and you're like, yeah, right. But it is the truth, because I had three agents that loved the story and wanted it. But there's always a but, right? One, she was right. She said it's not women's fiction, it's YA, and I don't rep YA. You know, I love the story, but I don't rep YA. So she's out. Another one really loved the story and wanted it, and she said she needed extra time to think about it. But then ultimately she's like, I'm just not sure if I can sell it. Okay, there's another one. So, and then the third one was really interested and asked for the full, but by that time I already signed with a small press, and so it was just timing. And she was like, oh, I'm sorry to miss this. I was really excited about it. So you can have 50 no's, but you're gonna have that one that loves it and sees the vision for it. And I think I found that agent that I go, okay, I really want to work with her. It just wasn't the right project at the right time, and I'm totally okay with that. So remembering that it's just about finding that right one who you know believes in your work, and then just being really patient with the process and trusting your work and trusting that you've done everything you can to make this story what it needs to be. And I think for me, you know, I love writing YA historical. It's what I've sort of, I don't know, been driven to this whole time. But now that I'm sort of stepped into historical fantasy, I'm like, okay, now this is the place where I can stay long term, because there's a huge market for it right now. YA historical is a hard sell because that age group wants romance and fantasy. And so you have to be honest with yourself and the publishing world at large. We talk about this all the time, right? Mm-hmm. This is the nature of the beast. These are the rules. We don't make them. And learning those boundaries of like, this is what is selling right now. And you don't write to market. That's not it. You're writing what calls to you, but you have to listen to what might be more marketable at the time.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we're out of time.
No, are we really?
Yes.
That would happen.
But thank you so much for talking to me today and for
Yeah.
sharing your experience, both as well. We didn't really talk about your self-publishing, so we'll have to do that another time.
No problem.
So
No,
you'll
thanks
have
for
to come
having
back.
me. I love talking books and writing and the writing process, and this is so fun. I love that you're doing this series.
Me too. All right, thank you, Kerry, and I'll talk to you in a few minutes when we do our other Zoom.
All right. Sounds
All
good.
right.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.